welcome back everybody. I hope you had a chance to open up the first video that I did, and I'm going to review a little bit because I know this is kind of an unusual way for us to get through the lectures, and so I want to make sure that things are making sense to you. But before I get started, just a couple of things to remember. I am getting the movie assignments in, so keep those coming on the email. The easiest way for me to get them is when you send them to the bgvmax@hotmail.com, because I do check that throughout the day. The other thing, when you do any communication with me, please put the section you're in, and that helps me a lot because I have 60 students in 2 different sections. So if your meeting days were Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you're in section A. Tuesday, Thursday, section B. So if you would add what section you're in whenever you're communicating with me, that would be a big help. Anyway, let's keep going here. If you remember, the chapter that we're on is about maladaptive behavior, and that's a behavior that's harmful to themselves or other people. So the first thing I covered in the first video was what causes maladaptive behavior. So as you're preparing for the test, be thinking of biological, psychological, or social things. And so that's what was in section 1. And then the developmental psychopathology, go back to what you already know. Development, stages of development. So psychopathology, the study of these maladaptive behaviors. So they're just looking at different developmental periods, starting in childhood, all the way to adulthood, and what could be going on with these people, and as it is, how they respond to the problems. Internalizing people tend to hold it in, and that leads to depression, and they call that covert, and externalizing people tend to act out, and it's called overt, not covert. By gender, primarily males are going to be externalizing, females are going to be internalizing, and so on. All right, so we completed that section, and now I want to move to the major section in this chapter that you're going to have most questions on the test, and that's the section dealing with substance abuse, including all the different drugs and alcohol. That also it's going to include what we'll call licit drugs, which would be the prescription medications that can be abused, and illicit drugs. So pay attention to that. So I'm going to give you a little test taking tip about this section. There could be questions about what is the most common or favorite or first choice that kids look for when they're doing drugs. Be very careful how the question is worded. If it just says that the #1 drug of choice among adolescents is, you're going to pick alcohol. Alcohol is the most easily acceptable. If it says the #1 drug, licit drug, meaning legal, on a daily basis, then you're going to pick cigarettes. And I'll get into that, but just be careful and read the question thoroughly. And the third one, it says, what is the #1 drug of choice that's illicit? Then that's going to be marijuana, because it is illegal for minors to partake of marijuana. Okay, so keep that in mind, and I'll try to review that with you again as we get a little further into this. All right, so the question then is, why do kids do drugs? And of course, there's any number of reasons why anybody does any type of drugs. So I think our nature is that we have a headache, we look for something to relieve that, and that would be aspirin. We have a stomach ache, we're looking for something, some Pepto-Bismol or some antacid, some Tums or something. So it's our tendency to look to the medical field to help alleviate that. So sometimes kids take drugs to eliminate the pain they're feeling, except for them it may be emotional pain. Could be family maladaptive behaviors within the family, dysfunctional families, and so they're trying to escape the reality of their situation, and the drugs allow them to do that for some period of time. Sometimes it's just out of curiosity. Kids just get curious, they hear about it, their friends have gone to some party and come back and they're talking about it, and they decide, you know what, I'd like to try that myself. But the number one reason that kids engage in any maladaptive behavior would be peer influence, what we typically call negative peer influence. And so as we go through the chapter, keep that in mind. And actually, there's really only going to be two really big influences in young people's lives. First, their family. Second, their peers. So if they're hanging out or associated with other kids who are engaging in, and it doesn't matter what section I cover, it could be drugs, it could be juvenile delinquent behavior, whatever it is, if they're associating with other kids who are engaging in those behaviors, they're more than likely themselves to eventually try it or get involved in it, especially if the peers are older than them. And I'm going to consider older peers to be someone older than 2 years outside of their age bracket. So a 14-year-old hanging out with some 16, 17, 18-year-olds is much more at risk than a 14-year-old hanging out with other 14-year-olds. Okay? Now, this screen is talking about terminology. It'll be important that you understand all the different terms used, whether the question itself requires that you define this, or it probably would be in the form of a scenario. So let's look at some of these. So tolerance is the first one. If you see someone who starts taking a substance and then it requires them to take more of the substance to get the same effect they originally got, that's because they developed tolerance for that drug. Our brain is designed in a way that it will try to ward off the impact that that drug has on our system, and as it does that to try to counteract it, then what happens is we have to take more of that same substance. So for instance, a heroin addict that might get the effect that they get the first time they ever use it, they'll never get that same effect again, but they will continue to increase the level of the heroin to chase after that initial feeling that they got. And so just think in terms of if you drink sodas and you get addicted to caffeine and you used to just drink one 12-ounce can and you find yourself having headaches, it might be the result that you have to consume more of that product. And we'll get into that in just a minute. But just for right now, understand it takes greater amount of a substance, and that's why people become more dependent. So let's look at the word dependence. The key here is physical dependence. And so this is just a real politically correct way of saying addicted. So if you have a physical dependence on a drug, that means that physiologically you are going to feel the impact if you don't consume that drug that day. So my example about caffeine, even in a can of soda, if you skip, or coffee would be another one, right? Just drink coffee every day. Go without drinking your coffee and see what happens. That will let you know that you have become physically dependent on that substance. So here's another test-taking tip. There's 3 major categories of drugs in this chapter: stimulants, depressants, and hallucinogenic. All of the drugs classified stimulant are going to be physically dependent substances. All of the drugs classified depressive are going to be physically dependent substances. The only category that would not fall in this group of addiction or physical dependence is going to be the hallucinogenic drugs. In other words, you're not going to feel the physiological effects of that, and so keep that in mind, and that'll help you a little bit. Now, right here where it talks about if you're the easiest way to know you're taking a drug that is physically dependent is you're going to experience withdrawal. So look at the third term I want you to be aware of. And withdrawal is an undesirable, intense pain or craving for that substance. So this isn't a pleasant feeling. So you're going to actually experience some physiological discomfort, headache, maybe nausea, maybe lethargic or drowsy, sleepy, irritability. You could experience cold sweats. So for instance, a person that becomes addicted to heroin, one of the reasons they're very reluctant to go get treatment is because they know what it feels like to go through withdrawal. Because before they even can get into treatment, they first have to detox. And that's the painful part, and that's the withdrawal part. And they know that. And so it is so uncomfortable for them, quite often they will just resist treatment. And then finally, you have psychological dependence. So go back to what I've told you from day one. Psychological is going to be the cognitive part. It's going to be what's going on in your mind, your thinking part. This is more about coping than anything else. And so when we talked about coping skills, and maybe some people go out and jog, some people may do yoga, exercise, different things is how they cope with stress. Psychological dependence would be a perfect example of a maladaptive form of coping while they're doing it for emotional reasons, stress, to relieve stress or problems that they feel like they have. Like I said a while ago, kids might say that they're trying to escape the reality of a dysfunctional family situation. Well, that would be psychological dependence. So you're not going to experience withdrawal. Keep that in mind. Physical, the withdrawal is going to be there. Psychological, you're not going to experience the withdrawal. Where the discomfort is going to come in, though, is going to be the emotional part, the psychological part. In other words, you feel stressed, you become dependent on some substance. So let me give you, remember I told you when I give you examples, it usually means that on the test there's going to be a scenario. So let's see if I come up with one for you that'll be helpful. So let's say this person is shy and feels uncomfortable around crowds of people, especially people that he or she does not know, and has been invited to a party. And before going to the party, the person consumes, it doesn't really matter what the substance is, let's just say a few glasses of wine, and that seems to relax them and makes them feel more at ease to go and mingle with people that they don't know very well. That would be a perfect example of psychological dependence. Don't get locked into what the substance is, even though the substance may be an addictive substance. Some people smoke cigarettes when they feel stressed out. Some people have a drink when they feel stressed out. So the question is not about whether it's a physical dependence. You look in the question, it's going to talk about why did they take it. That's the key to psychological. They take it to reduce the stress or anxiety. It helps them to feel like they can relax and cope with whatever it is. And so that's the 4 terms. I want you to make sure you can pick these out in a scenario of some sort. Don't expect just a definition here, but rather some sort of scenario, and it makes sense to you. Now in trends, we talked about, always remember what a trend is, a secular trend, patterns of change over time. And so as we study the use of drugs over time, I'm going to give you a little bit of information here that I hope you'll find helpful. But remember the thing about any type of research, numbers, it's only as good as the data that you put in. And the biggest problem with information about drugs is whether it's valid information or not, whether people are actually going to give you truthful answers, and especially young people who may be very reluctant to give you these numbers. But let's just look at the country overall, starting back in the 60s. If you remember in chapter 1, I talked about kind of the different eras in American history, and we talked about an increase in drugs starting in the 60s and through the 70s. That's pretty accurate when the drugs really started hitting our country and we became aware that we were having a problem with this. This is where maybe you've got to take this with a grain of salt. In the 80s, it says that we had an overall decrease in the use of drugs in America. That's when we started the war on drugs. That's when we started to just say no to drugs. That's when we started the campaigns in the schools to help the young people. The problem is also at that time, in the 60s, you see, everybody talked about how cool it was to do drugs. Just get high, if it feels good, do it, and that sort of mentality. By the 80s now, we're putting a stigma on it, and so people aren't so quick to just say, yeah, I do drugs, yeah, I've done these drugs in the last 30 days. So you don't necessarily get accurate numbers here. A slight increase back in the early 90s, I would maybe make a note here. You're looking at 90 through maybe 93, 94. The increase here was the reintroduction of some drugs that had fallen off from previous use, like LSD. When I cover that drug, you'll find that it was quite popular in the 60s, and then it really did fall off in the 80s, and I'll cover that in a minute. But you have a new generation here, and so it's reintroduced, and so we saw a little spike here, especially in the LSD drugs, and so that would be true. But then supposedly, currently, what you're going to find in your book, it's going to say it over and over. Generally, when you're asking kids about the use of drugs within the last 30 days, they're going to say, no, I don't do drugs, or I didn't do drugs. And so the statistics are going to show a slight decrease overall. Out in the real world, I'm not sure that we can count on those numbers, but for our purposes, that is the answer. So continuing with the trends of the overall use, I put a star by this, and you know what I mean when I tell you that. Put a star by it, highlight it, do something. You know, we live in the United States of America. We have all sorts of wonderful privileges above everybody else and plenty of everything, and yet we still have the highest rate of drug use among our young people than any other country in the industrialized world. Even that number is still probably an underestimate. Put a star by it, because the surveys that we take, especially when you a face-to-face type of interview, for instance, with young people, it's going to likely give you an underestimate. And here's why: because number one, go back to kids in school who's chronic runaways, and if you're going to go and you want to get information from young people in America, young people are in school. And so the place you go to do your surveys to interview these kids is school. The problem is a lot of kids who are on drugs are not at school. The second problem with that is the kids that you are talking to are going to be very reluctant to just be forthcoming and tell you that, yes, I've done some drugs in the last 30 days, and yes, I'll tell you which drug. They're really not going to be just open and forthright about that. And so keep that in mind when we look at these numbers. Now, what I want to cover today, before we get into these categories of drugs, the author takes the subject of alcohol, and he puts it in a section by itself in his chapter. So if you're following me in the book, and hopefully you're following me on PowerPoint, making a few notes, then we're going to cover this section, and that'll be it for this week, for today anyway, and hopefully you're finding this helpful. A while ago I mentioned this: alcohol, the most widely used drug by adolescents. Now, the key to that is here, binge drinking. Make sure you understand what binge drinking is. Kids aren't going to consume alcohol typically on a daily basis. What they're going to do is binge drink. So binge drinking is 5 or more drinks in a short period of time. Typically this is going to be on the weekends. They're going to find out somewhere they're having a party, somebody's getting together, and everybody's bringing alcohol, and they're going to consume a lot of alcohol. The other reason is the number one substance is availability. I mean, let's think about it. It's a legal substance in America, you know, in any store. You can go purchase it, not young people, but it's readily accessible, meaning they can get it pretty easily. If the families have it in their homes, they can just get it out of the liquor cabinet, out of the refrigerator, and bring some to these binge parties. I'm going to encourage you that you don't really need to memorize these numbers. That would be a lot to remember, but keep in mind it's the third leading killer in America, meaning drunk drivers, people dying in car accidents. And we talked about that in another chapter when we talked about kids especially. It was accidental deaths were the number one reason, especially when it was related to drinking and driving. But I would pay attention to this. When you see 65%, we're talking about 2 out of 3 domestic violent incidents in the home, male on female, is going to be due to alcohol. So the male, 2 out of 3 times, consuming alcohol, drunk, domestic violence, which of course in itself is a huge problem, because these things can become quite violent, and people end up killing people in these homes while they're under the influence. Here's one that a lot of you may not know. Alcohol is a depressant. So we consume alcohol because we want to have fun. We want to go to a party. We want to celebrate. It's part of our culture. And so I don't think anybody wants to be depressed. Nobody wants to take something that makes them depressed, and yet, what are they talking about here? Why would we consume something that's a depressant? Because if we are depressed, we're looking for something, an antidepressant, to lift our mood. And so what they're really talking about here is you've got to go back to your biology on your central nervous system. What is being depressed is your central nervous system. So your heart rate, your pulse, these things are going to be shutting down, not going up. And if you consume enough alcohol, your speech will be slurred, your ability to hold your balance, all of these things is just a sign that physiologically you are shutting down. It is slowing down the functions that you normally could do easily, drowsiness. If you consume enough alcohol, I guarantee you, you will go into a complete pass out. Some people would say blackout. Some people could go into a coma, and ultimately, there are people who die from alcohol poisoning because their whole physiological system, their heart just stopped beating altogether. And I'm not sure that people realize the seriousness of that. Well, let's look at the population that we talk about a lot, which is adolescents and emerging adults. And so among college students, look at this number, 50% are considered heavy drinkers. And again, that's primarily binge drinking, a lot of parties. There are colleges that are known for, their campuses are known for that. They are party campuses. And so some students that are in these universities know that there are a lot of drinking. There is a lot of drinking going on there. Now here, let's think about this for a second. As they consume alcohol, some of the problems that are associated with this, you may see the word correlated to this. You're going to miss class. You miss class, your grades go down. You're putting yourself at risk for high-risk behaviors, injury, falling down, and encountering with the police. You know, when the police approach you and tell you you have the right to remain silent, if you're drunk, you probably don't have the common sense to be quiet, and so you just end up getting in more trouble. Now let me add another thing here before I get to this screen. I don't have it on the previous screen, so let's go back and see if you want to add it in here, be helpful. I want you to think about this. Young people who drank alcohol in high school, when they transition to college, the level of drinking increases. So I'll say that again. The young people that I told you about, the number one reason young people, adolescents drink, I said was alcohol, binge drink on weekends. That group that eventually go into college, they drink even more in college. So their level of drinking and the amount that they consume goes up. The young people who did not drink in high school, then as they transition into the workforce, and by the way, even the ones who did drink, let me say it this way, the ones who don't go on to college, maybe a better way to share that with you, that went straight into the workforce, their level of drinking, whether they drank in high school or not, actually decreased. And they think because once you have a job, you have some responsibility to get up every day and go to work, you lose your job. Whereas going to college, if you skip a class, you're not going to get fired from school, you just skip a class. And so that's an important number to remember. Now, let's continue with the risk factors. In this chapter, two major influences, family and peers. Both of these have a tremendous impact on maladaptive behavior for young people because they're very susceptible and they're very influenced by their families. And so if we're talking about putting young people at risk, then these are all negative, of course. Dysfunction in the family, all of these we talked about in chapter 8. So we're talking about the prolonged, intense conflict. See here, the high conflict. This is a lot of fighting, abuse, neglect, and all that sort of thing. When I talk to you about insecure attachment, remember chapter 8, there was never a bond, there's no strong commitment to family, and so they're out with their friends, their peers, and so this group will have even more of an influence. Parents who don't monitor their kids, go back and check that section on monitoring, I told you about that. When monitoring goes down, level of maladaptive behavior goes up. So when parents are not monitoring their kids, which is a reminder, it's a form of supervision, who are their friends, what are they up to? If they're not monitoring, then you can expect that they're at risk of all the different maladaptive behaviors in this chapter. And then finally, the parents themselves drink. And so in a sense, they're a negative role model for their kids. There's alcohol in the home and the kids have access to it. Now, peer pressure, and of course, there's positive peer pressure, but we're talking about risky behavior here, remember. And so we're really talking about negative peer influence. And here's the key. When the kids hang out with kids older than themselves, and then whatever behavior those older kids are doing, that's what these other young people will engage in. So it's going to be almost a fill in the blank. They're hanging out with older kids who drink, hanging out with older kids who smoke pot, hanging out with older kids who are trying ecstasy. So it doesn't matter what this behavior is, these kids are at high risk of engaging in that same behavior as those older peers. And that also applies to older siblings, by the way. I'm not going to ask any questions from this screen, so don't worry about this one. But if I do, the answer is blank. Okay? All right. Well, I hope that's helpful. My wife's laughing at me, so it's time to go. And we'll wrap this up for today. I'll be posting some more of these next week. And just give me a call if you need some help, or email me. Thank you. Bye-bye.